I'm Paul Edwards, author of the Mourners Woods books, and first and foremost, a monster kid. If you're anything like me, you enjoy vintage horror, but you feel like you've seen all of the vintage horror films. You've seen all the Universal Studios horror movies a million times. You've seen all of the Bela Lugosi Poverty Row films, and you wish that there was more vintage horror content that you could enjoy, but you feel like you've seen it all. I discovered the solution to this problem a couple of years ago: vintage horror radio. There's a never-ending supply of vintage horror radio programs that recordings still survive for. You could start listening now to vintage horror radio, and for the rest of your life, you could keep listening to it without listening to the same broadcast twice. That's how many there are. There are so many of these. So it's a fresh source of vintage horror for you. It's just not in the visual format, but the advantage, of course, to radio is you can listen to it, while you're falling asleep or driving, or hopefully not falling asleep while driving. But vintage horror radio is sort of an undiscovered territory for a lot of monster fans. So I thought I would give you my top 10 recommendations. These are the top 10 horror anthology shows from the era of vintage radio. So all of these are anthology programs. So it doesn't matter which episode you start with. They're all individual standalone stories. Okay. Number 1 and number 2 on the list are the two really popular horror anthology vintage radio shows. The Inner Sanctum, which ran from 1941 to 1952. And there were about a little over 500 episodes of this. And Suspense. Suspense ran from 1940 to 1962. It was like the Gunsmoke of radio. It ran for so long, 22 years. There were about 900 episodes of Suspense. And a lot of big name actors appeared in both the Inner Sanctum and especially in Suspense. The difference between the two is that Inner Sanctum is more focused on horror. Suspense has plenty of horror stories, but a lot of them are crime stories where there's nothing supernatural happening. But for example, probably the single best remembered episode of Suspense is Sorry, Wrong Number, which has Agnes Moorehead, yes, and Dora from Bewitched, playing the part of an invalid who overhears a murder being plotted on a crossed telephone line. Back in the 20th century, you occasionally would pick up a different telephone conversation on a telephone line. And she overhears a murder plot, and she tries to contact the police and get somebody to believe her and pay attention that a murder is about to be committed tonight. And I won't spoil the twist for you, but it's absolutely worth hearing. And it's a broadcast they repeated a number of times. So if you are looking for supernatural horror, you're more likely to get it out of the Inner Sanctum. Suspense did have supernatural stories, but they had plenty of crime thriller stories also. And these two are the big, well-remembered horror programs. You can easily find these online. And there are very, very many surviving episodes. We have most, if not all, of the episodes of both of these shows. From here on, we're going to lesser-known radio programs, or at least less remembered ones. Number 3 is Lights Out. Lights Out had a pretty good run from 1934 to 1947. And it was a more horror-oriented show like Inner Sanctum. And it had some crime stories like Suspense, but it was more horror-oriented. Number 4 is actually the first horror radio show. It started in 1931. And objectively, it's the best of any of them. It's called The Witch's Tale. The problem with The Witch's Tale is that the sound quality of the surviving episodes is not great. Remember, these were radio shows. The sound quality of preserved copies varies from show to show. If you get into Suspense or The Inner Sanctum, there are really good audio quality copies of those that you can find online. The Witch's Tale is such a good show, but unfortunately, it's got a lot of static scratchiness to it as you listen to the surviving episodes. What happens in The Witch's Tale is that the host is Nancy, the old witch, who gives a different age for herself in every episode, but it's always over 100. And, she's 113 in one episode and 108 in the next episode and so forth. And she's invited you to sit by the fire with her and gaze into the embers as she tells you this week's horrifying story. And Nancy, the old witch, was actually at first portrayed by a mature actress, but then that actress died, and they had a teenage girl take over the part playing Nancy, the 100-year-old witch, but she did great at it. Really, really well at it. And the character of Nancy the Old Witch became the inspiration for the EC Comics character that was a companion to the Crypt Keeper and the Vault Keeper. So, if you are a fan of EC Comics, you'll immediately recognize the vibe of The Witch's Tale. And it's a rough listen. If you can sit through the static, it's absolutely worth it, because these are terrifying stories. They're real two-fisted horror stories. Also, I should point out, if anyone out there has the technical prowess to, I forget which one is remix and which one is remaster. So let's just say fix. If anyone out there has the technical prowess to fix the noise on an old radio show and wants to contribute something to horror fandom, fixing The Witch's Tale so we can all hear it would be awesome. The Witch's Tale ran for a really long time, but unfortunately, its creator destroyed a whole bunch of the existing episodes in, I think it was 1960. I don't know why. I don't know what his reasoning was. I'm not happy that it happened, but we only have a limited number of Witch's Tale episodes left. About 67 or 68 Witch's Tale episodes still exist. Okay, we're getting more obscure now. These are lesser and less known. Number 5 is The Hermit's Cave. The Hermit was the horror host who would introduce himself to you and say that he was going to tell you this week's story, and he would cackle at you at the thought that you were going to be scared by it. A lot of these were horror host format shows. So The Hermit's Cave ran from 1937. It had about 40 episodes. The Weird Circle is actually a pretty good one, and we have pretty good sound recordings of The Weird Circle. This ran from 1943 to 1945. We have about 70 episodes of The Weird Circle. And it would begin with the host saying, "In this cave by the restless sea, we are called to remember the story of," and then it would say the name of, Frankenstein or The Pit and the Pendulum or whatever. "The immortal tale of so-and-so. Bellkeeper, toll the bell so that all will know that we are gathered again in the weird circle." And, then they would go into the ordinary radio drama. And at the end, the Weird Circle's meeting would be adjourned. The next one I want to tell you about is The Sealed Book. Very similar to the Weird Circle, except in the Sealed Book, the bookkeeper has a gigantic book with all the world's stories in it. And each week he will flip through the sealed book. He will unseal the book and flip through it for you and find this week's story. Almost always a horror story. So The Sealed Book from 1945 is one you should check out. I will put The Whistler on the list. I'm not a big fan of The Whistler, but it had enough of a following that it's worth mentioning. It ran from 1942 to 1955, so that's a really good run. I find The Whistler to be more corny than the others. The Whistler, as you can imagine, is a horror host who is whistling in the dark as he approaches you on the street and then tells you this week's horror story and then whistles as he walks off into the darkness again. It's okay. I mean, give it a try. I don't mind some level of corniness. You have to understand that this is several generations ago idea of entertainment. So you have to expect some of the way that these things are presented to be dated. But The Whistler just hasn't aged as well as some of these others have. But I'll put it on the list because it was successful and there are a lot of episodes of it that still exist. Number 9 is a really obscure one from 1944. Creeps by Night. Yup, Creeps by Night. It delivers what it promises. This is a more horror and monster-oriented show. There aren't all that many episodes of it, but it's worth checking out. Number 10 is called Quiet Please. Quiet Please ran from 1947 to 1949. It was not strictly horror. They had plenty of horror episodes, but it was also, mysteries, suspense stories, things like that. So those are my top 10 recommendations for vintage horror radio. Now, if you want to keep going further down this rabbit hole, there are also science fiction shows like X-1, The Seventh Dimension. There were a fair share of science fiction radio shows that had horror elements to them. And also, if you get into this kind of thing, but you just can't stand the static from the 1930s, you can listen to some of the shows that were generated in the 1960s and especially 1970s, where they were trying to revive interest in the format of radio anthology shows. And a good example of that is The Devil and Mr. O. That's a very, very monster and horror-oriented radio show. And there were some others as well. But the topic of the video is vintage. So as far as the 1930s and 40s go, those are some of my recommendations. I should also give honorary mention to The Shadow. The Shadow is not strictly a horror show. It's a superhero crime show, but it has so many horror elements in it on an every episode basis that it's worth mentioning. The Shadow, of course, is not an anthology show. It follows Lamont Cranston, who's a millionaire who has learned special mental powers and uses them to fight criminals that the law cannot handle on its own. The Shadow, by the way, was one of the inspirations for the character of Batman. So The Shadow is not actually a horror show, but if you're also interested in, spooky radio shows that are not strictly horror, it's absolutely worth checking out, especially the early episodes where the Shadow was voiced by Orson Welles. He was voiced by a number of actors over the years, but Orson Welles was my favorite, probably most people's favorite, of The Shadow. Incidentally, if you go into this never-ending supply of horror radio shows, you'll find that a lot of big-name horror movie actors appeared in them, including Boris Karloff, Bela Lugosi, and Peter Lorre. So you'll hear some familiar voices turn up in the world of horror radio. Are there any horror radio shows that you have discovered that you think I should have put on the list? If so, please let me know in the comments. And if you are a fan of vintage horror and classic monsters, check out my book series, the Mourners Woods books. I recapture the vibe and feel of 20th century vintage horror, but in a contemporary setting. I'm self-published on Amazon. I'll drop a link to my books in the description for this video. Thanks for letting me introduce you possibly to the world of vintage horror radio. I'll see you in Mourners Woods.